In this episode, I'm once again joined by Daizan Skinner, a British Zen Roshi trained in both the Soto and Rinzai schools of Zen. Daizan reveals the iconic Zen training technique of the Koan and its manifold uses within the tradition. Daizan explains how waking up works, how he diagnoses his students' enlightenments, and why he's very demanding on his trainee teacher's psychological maturity. Daizan also discusses how awakening relates to moral purification, why so many famous Zen teachers have engaged in abusive behaviour, and reveals the esoteric energy and health practices of the Rinzai Zen lineage. So without further ado, Daizan Skinner. So one of the characteristics of your training, as you described it, with Shinzan Roshi, was the use of Koan. Can you talk a little bit about your experiences of the Koan method as a way of training?
Okay, so the Koan system, as I encountered it, I think it's probably one of the sort of genius constructions of human creativity and ingenuity. And unfortunately, it's largely submerged. Not all that many people have been through it, and certainly not enough to get a sense of the fiendish cleverness, really, of the whole thing. So basically, as I encountered it, I've just done one thread of Koan study, and I did a tiny bit in Soto, but it was very de-emphasized. So you have within Japan, you have two major streams of Koan study. You have what's called the Inzan line and the Takuju line. Now, you've also got Koan study in China and Korea as well. Now, if you go to, for example, Korea, they'll give you one question, one koan. What is this? I think is a very prominent sort of favorite. And you'll kind of study that one. That will be the focus point of your meditation for life. And they'll use other questions and other histories and so on when they're sort of testing and understanding, when you've had some kind of shift. But you'll go back to your, what is this? And, we have hundreds of years of that working really, really well. So that's obviously one way that it's done. Now, within Japan, within these two streams, you have the Inzan line, which is kind of has got a lot of different things that we study. But the Takuju line, the other one, the main difference, as far as I understand it, is that they use a lot of quotations in their responses to particular koans. So, for example, you might be studying the koan, okay, you know the sound of two hands. What is the sound of one hand? And you'll use that as your direction of attention in your practice. You'll continue to focus on that like a cat at a mouse hole until you and the koan are not two different things. And something amazing happens at that point, because I suppose perhaps the great secret of all this work is that when you become one with any one thing, including the koan, you become one with everything. And so you, as it were, you enter the world of the one hand. You directly abide there, if you like. So, okay, so then maybe your teacher approves of that and accepts that. So then, to a small extent within the Inzan line, but a considerable extent within Takuju, there's a sort of a kind of a reference book that you keep in your sleeve that's got loads of kind of quotations. A lot of it's from Tang Dynasty poetry, which is the sort of like the high point of the Chinese poetic tradition, really. So you go and find a line out of one of these poems, or a Zen quote or whatever, that also kind of expresses this this shift that you've encountered, that you've actually embodied. And then you have to go through this book, and again, you bring these sort of quotations to your teacher until you find the one that he accepts. Now, we have a certain amount of that in the Takaju line, but they have a lot in the Inzen line, but they have a lot in Takaju, as far as I understand. So basically, the point is that particularly as the study goes on, you're learning to, as it were, bring they often say to bring heaven and earth together. So essentially, if you can think of, for example, our way of thinking, our way of forming concepts, our way of using language, it's all based in the world of subject-object, if you like, the world of the two hands, this against that. Ultimately, little old you against the great big hostile universe. And so learning how to, as it were, embody and then express that non-self truth within the structures of dualism and separation and so on is a big part of the Koan curriculum. And finding these both direct embodiments, if you like, or responses to these predicaments or these scenarios, but then also finding these quotations as also a way of essentially beginning to think and express the truth poetically. And you go through, over the years of your practice, you go through this book hundreds of times until more and more and more of these quotations start to kind of stick. And so when you begin to teach, you've got this kind of reservoir of ways, if you like, of expressing this non-separative or non-dual, perhaps we could say, understanding. So you start off in the process in Koan study with a bunch of these koans or these questions, these scenarios, which are basically require a direct entry into this non-separative reality or this non-separative mindset, perhaps we could say. You've got a bunch of those. They call those Hoshin koans, and Hoshin means Dharma body. The Dharma body. Essentially, it's a sort of goes back to the Mahayana Buddhist teaching, in which the Dharma body of the Buddha is, if you like, the Buddhahood that's present, or the enlightenment that's present in every moment, in everything. So we want to enter that world of universal Buddhahood, if you like. That's the start point. And then there's a whole sort of hundreds, basically, of subsidiary or follow-on questions, which enable you to, as it were, differentiate within the non-differentiated, to, as it were, bring together. Well, on a personal level, you could say that the early practice is very, very non-intellectual. It's very much about dethroning the intellect, about allowing that sort of inner little control freak to, as it were, take a subsidiary place. But then later on, you're learning how to bring this holistic understanding and this separative or intellectual understanding together. And some of the later koans, you're even writing essays, you're writing poems of your own. And there's basically a whole sort of education, really, embodied within the system. So that by the time you come out at the end of it, you should have, if it's done right, you should have a very, very grounded sense of these two dimensions, if you like, and how they sort of can interact, because it's seen as not enough that you just enter that non-dual or non-separative world. A dog does that, as far as we can tell. And it's a beautiful thing, of course, but a dog has, in a sense, no option other than to be an absolutely perfect dog. You know, to be the universe manifesting in doggy form, if you like. But what a dog doesn't seem to be able to do, that you and I can do, is we can do that too, but we can also take a step back. We can also admire this gobsmackingly amazing, beautiful, crazy universe as well. We can, as it were, be the eyes of the universe. And so we can actually take, as it were, both positions. And so my teacher's first website, or at least the first website that I was ever familiar with, he called it not1not2.com. We don't settle anywhere. It's like we encompass, if you like, both, a sort of and the whole Koan system is really a means that again and again and again you come back to different dimensions, different perspectives, if you like, so it's like a scheme of development, at least the way it's developed there in Japan.
That's very interesting. In our first interview, you talked in detail about the 4 stages of insight, from stream entry through to arhat, and you recounted some of your experiences that matched up with some of those path attainments. And often in the Zen literature, Koan is an entry to Kensho. So is sometimes getting hit with a stick and, by the teacher and so on. But there's all different sorts of interesting ways. But I noticed that you recounted 3 major shifts. None of them was directly related to Koan. And it seems you're talking about here Koan having not only a direct insight function, but also some sort of integrative function between insight and operating, and also maybe even a means of teacher training or a means of communication of insight. So I'm curious if you could perhaps compare Kensho or Satori, things of this nature, to the 4-path model, if you see where they might map in, and also what you've noticed in terms of your students achieving insight and path shifts and so on, in terms of the many different methods. What have you noticed being statistically the most likely to be the thing you're doing when you have a path shift?
Okay. All right. Well, so I think there's an image that resonates very strongly with me. I think it's back in Buddha Gosha, which is a Theravadan practice manual from about the 5th century, and he has this image of you've got a river, you've got a tree, and you've got a rope hanging from a tree branch, and so you're holding onto the rope, and you push out over the river, and you push out, and you kind of swing the rope, and at a certain point, there's a letting go, and you're across the river. Now, obviously, without the pushing out, without the intentionality, you hold onto the rope, you let go, you're going to end up exactly where you started. If you only push out without any letting go, you're also not going to get anywhere. And I think that unpacks it quite nicely. The image in Zen, the oldest image to my knowledge, that sort of unpacks it clearly, is the one that's right at the beginning of the Zen text called the Momonkan, the gate of Mu, or the open gate, or the empty gate, sometimes called. And the image is you've arrived at a village and it's after dark. They've already locked the gate. And so you pick up a stone from the side of the road and you knock and you listen and you knock and you listen. And you just keep on doing that. And at a certain point, somebody gets out of bed, I don't know, gets dressed, goes down the stairs, whatever, comes and opens the gate. Now, I think this unpacks the process as far as I can understand it as clearly as it probably can be. So you get certain people who say, well, any intentionality is effectively what you should do is go and just sit by the gate, meditate your little tail off by the gate. And of course, now and again, the gate does open, you know. It's a low chance of success. Most people don't succeed in that approach, but some do, a few do. On the other hand, you get types who are very into the intentionality. into the knocking, if you like. But the trouble is then, when they're knock, 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 they're so focused on the knocking that even as the gate opens, they can't enter. You know what I mean? They're stuck. So the combination, the magic formula seems to be both the knocking and the listening, the intentionality and the openness. And in properly done Koan study, you've got both of those elements. Because the thing is, you can't open the gate. You can't make it happen, but you can set up the conditions. And Koan study is a very, very good way to set up the conditions, particularly for that first opening in the gate. We do a 64-hour retreat, like a long weekend retreat that's entirely focused on really getting that process working for people. And typically we get about 60% of the people who come get it in that 64-hour period, get that first step in the gate, if you like. We've even had things like, I remember a lady came one time and there'd been some crossed wires or something, and she thought it was like a spa weekend. She'd come with her little swimming trunks and all that, and thought she was going to be getting facials and all that. Anyway, I explained to her, she'd never meditated before. I explained to her what we were doing, and she decided to join in, and she got it. She still practices with us now. So it's not that hard to do if you get, as it were, the formula right. But within the formula, you don't make it happen. You just, as it were, you set up the conditions. Now, within that sort of thing, that exact moment of opening the gate, some people get it when they're actually sat on their cushion in, if you like, a formal practice modality. But I would say the majority of people actually get it, when they just walk through a doorway and boom, there it is. Or it's almost like the practice has created a potentiality, a sort of a spiritual pregnancy is frequently the image that's used, and then just something happens and there they are. And sometimes that can be something of a sort of a dimmer switch quality, and sometimes it's like a light switch turning on, turning off. Sometimes it's kind of emotional, people start crying or laughing or dancing around the garden, all that kind of stuff. And other times it's very peaceful. It's almost like, oh, it's kind of like no great sort of emotional catharsis or whatever. But because, anyway, none of that's terribly important because all of that wears off. The thing that tends not to wear off, if it's real, is that shift in awareness, if you like. I find myself saying to people very frequently, it's not in itself an experience. Although there are often experiences around it, it's a shift in the way you relate to all experiences. And that, if it's real, then is yours. It doesn't wear off. It's something that, you've got it. Once you've got it, you've got it. Once you've seen blue, you've seen blue. It's like, it's done deal.
I'm curious what your diagnostic criteria are if you have a process that you go through with somebody when they come to you. I understand in the Zen tradition, it is traditional to report your insight to a senior teacher of some sort, your teacher or whoever you can find. So that, I presume, is part of your role. Which diagnostic criteria do you have? What's your process?
Well, they have a saying in Zen, a thief recognizes a thief. So I remember I lived in Newcastle for a while, and I knew a lady up there she'd been a heroin addict in London. She'd moved up to Newcastle to get away from it all, And I remember she said to me, one time, she could step into a pub and in one glance, she could pick out the junkies, boom, 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 And so there's something of that, and that's traditionally the way. Personally, what I like to do is I just give people the goalposts. I say, well, the Buddha's take on this is, he says there's basically 3 criteria, if you like, for that first step in the gate. You've seen through the optical illusion of me as a fixed, solid billiard ball rolling across the table of life. That is so clearly not how it is. It's just laughable. Okay, is that true? Doubt, no doubt about it. A little bit like my view is it's a bit like when you're 7 years old, you've worked out that Father Christmas doesn't exist. And once you've got that, doesn't matter how many Christmas cards you get with big red jolly guys on, you're vanishingly unlikely to start believing in Father Christmas again. You don't need to remind yourself. You don't need to chant Father Christmas mantras. When you got it, you got it. You know, so there's that. There's no doubt about it. And then the third thing, you know that this isn't a matter of rites, rituals, or righteousness. It's not a matter of a particular form of ceremony or magic or being a good person even. It's simply a matter of seeing how things are clearly enough. That's it. The Buddha put it out there. Check it out for yourself, you know. And, you know, there's, I don't want to stand in anybody's way. If that's true for them, that's true for them. And if it ain't, it ain't. I mean, there can be, there can sometimes be, I suppose, where you know, I'm a little bit more involved, really, is there are situations where somebody's absolutely convinced they've got it, and actually they haven't. Or they're actually there, but they just can't quite see it. It's like and those kind of sort of boundary type situations, I suppose, I think I can probably help a bit there. Sometimes you can just give somebody that little bit of a nudge to just, you know what I mean, that sort of stuff. But, you know, probably even somebody is, you know, I mean, I'm probably pretty incompetent around this area. There's probably people way, way more skilled around all that sort of thing. But even with the broad brush stuff that I tend to do, it's not that hard to do. It's really not that hard. So we get lots of people who get that first step in the door. But, you know, I mean, it's perfectly possible to have that genuine understanding, to have it in a, if you like, a permanent way, and still the forces of inadequacy or what traditionally greed, if you like, or wanting, and the forces of aversion, you know, the hatred type stuff, to be utterly untouched. So you could still have somebody who's really a pretty nasty piece of work, and they've still got, you know, a genuine understanding. So it ain't the end of the story by a long chalk. There's still a lot to be done. And while that can be done relatively rapidly, or in fact very rapidly, the subsequent stuff, the dealing with those, if you like, instinctual forces of push, pull, and so on, seems to take really some engagement and really some time.
Seems like you're using that 10 fetter model for your diagnosis there, and those fetters are later path shifts, more directly attack those particular fetters.
That's right, yeah. I mean, there's plenty of other roadmaps, if you like. We use the ox herding pictures a bit. You know, that's sort of within the actual process of going on that journey. That one works pretty nicely. I found people find that fairly helpful as a way of sort of navigating. But some of the sort of, you know, the if you like, the high Mahayana stuff is so sublime, so extraordinary that it just, people don't really find it relatable, and that includes me. You know, it's like, it's you know, it's so extraordinary, so transmundane that I'm not sure how valuable that is.
Well, I'd like to ask you about that actually, but first, you mentioned a thief recognizes a thief, and you used the example of the heroin addict who could spot a junkie. And often when a heroin addict spots another heroin addict, there's a sense of I just know, but depending on you know, how aware of how they know, they can often actually detail exactly what it is, something about the body language, something about the way in which one's self is relating to the environment. There are some markers, I think, that one could even learn to identify when one isn't a heroin addict. Maybe if there was recognize a heroin addict school run by ex-heroin addicts, they could train you to see things the way they see things. I'm curious, when you say thief recognizes a thief, other than the fetters, what are the small things that you notice?
I wish I could give you an analytical list. I wish I could. I don't think I can really, but I suppose that's one of the reasons why the training is as it is, because that's, it's certainly with the Koan study and so on, that's part of what's going on. Some of the later koans that you study involve people who are, if you like, in various shades of awakening and delusion and so on. So you're studying them, as it were, with your teacher. More than that, I remember, for example, I got to visit the very first monastery that my teacher became a monk in one time, and I was present at a talk that the Roshi of that temple gave, and it just didn't. I mean, the words were all there, but it seemed like the music wasn't. So I went back and talked to my teacher about it, and he said, yeah, that's right. Not everybody's, not everybody's in the same place. And so it's how can I say? I'd love to be able to just give you the 10 sure signs. And I really don't think I can. I don't think I can. But right in the point of it happening, it can be very, very, very obvious, very clear. And one of the most beautiful things, perhaps one of the most sublime things a human being can experience, is another human being waking up right in front of their eyes. It's akin to being present at a birth or being present at a death. And one of the beautiful things about this 64-hour retreat that we do is people are face-to-face a lot of the time. And this is very contagious. So when you've got, even if you're really stuck in the mud, you've got somebody in front of you who's radiating that reality, who's speaking from that reality, embodying that reality. It certainly rattles the cage if it doesn't actually do the job with this person. And, actually there's a sort of a contagion, as it were, within it all, which is very powerful. And actually one of the reasons why, from way, way back, why Zen monasteries are set up the way they are, why people sit close together, why they're not, you could easily have everybody go and sit in their own little cells or something like that. But no, they pack them in together like sardines in a tin. And, you stick them in a place where this has happened. I mean, if you've been in an old zendo where you've had maybe, I don't know, a couple of 100, 300 years worth of people do this stuff within, there's a power there, and that can have an effect as well. If you're around a teacher who's pretty on beam, if that teacher's got some good assistants who are also on beam, there's a lot that you can do to sort of increase the likelihood. I mean, the key thing, of course, is somebody really having that intentionality, that wanting to do it, for this to be their purpose and their direction. But there's a fair bit that you can do around the edges to sort of increase the odds, if you like. Is that increase the odds or reduce the odds? I'm never sure how that works. Make it more likely.
Set and setting, isn't that what they say? Set and setting.
Set and setting.
Yeah, that's what the hippies of the 60s said. When you're going to go on a grand LSD journey, as was done by many hippies who eventually became Zen masters, actually, in America in particular. I think there's a long history of that. They always talked about set and setting. Set is the context and setting is the place and the immediate environment. That's very interesting.
Yeah, yeah, can certainly help. Mind you, it seems that a ton of people have done this on battlefields. You know, in all kinds of situations, and in fact, as we mentioned, it's not that uncommon that somebody sort of primes the pump and then they're sat on the toilet. Or we've had a striking number of people get it in the middle of the night. They literally wake up, sit up in bed, boom, there it is. Or even as they fall asleep, or even in the dream, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, that is fascinating. You mentioned that some of the loftier Mahayana accounts or Mahayana doctrines about what's possible on the path can be a little difficult to relate to, even for you. And there is, I think, often different opinions about the degree to which moral perfection, let's say, is possible in terms of awakening. I've heard some people take a very traditional route that interpret the 10 fetters very traditionally, so that by the time one is reaching second, third, fourth path, one has completely expunged all desire, all craving and aversion, and is incapable of various different acts, like even having sex, for instance. That's some people go that way. Others say that actually, this would be the other radical view, I think, that these four paths represent a perceptual shift or a shift in awareness, as you mentioned, that don't necessarily, may have some sort of knock-on effect in terms of moral action, but aren't necessarily on the same axis of development. So I'm curious, yourself, you mentioned second and hinted at third path in your previous account, but you mentioned that the moral perfection models that sometimes one sees in very traditional Theravada or the lofty end of Mahayana, as you said. I'm curious if you perhaps can comment on that, where you sit in that spectrum or how you see that whole idea. Of course, we also know, I think, of great, highly enlightened Roshis, Lamas, and so on, well regarded, but who have done, at least, let's say, morally ambiguous things. There's a long history of that. It seems to be almost any master who lives long enough, is who's famous enough, comes out somehow, So I'm curious about how you see that whole interaction of perceptual shifts, awareness shifts, the experience of craving and aversion, and moral conduct as it's defined even in the Mahayana. Because I understand if we talk about moral conduct, we're opening a bit of a philosophical kind of worms there. What is morality and so on? But even in the Mahayana, even in the tradition, there's a moral code, I think. So anyway, can you make something of that? I've shot a whole bunch of rounds at you.
Yeah, okay. Well, it's very important, I think. So, as part of this process of Koan study that we talked about, towards the end, getting near the end of the whole thing, you study the precepts, the moral code of Zen as koans. And of course, we're all facing these really. For example, do not kill, the not killing precept. So, okay, maybe you don't murder people, maybe you don't walk around murdering people, great. But then what about animals? But then what about plants? Lettuce leaves have life. And if you don't even eat those, then you end up killing yourself. And sometimes I get this with students. People come and essentially what they're coming for is they want me to give them the pat on the head. Yep, you're a good boy. Yep, you got it. Yep, nice. And not frequently, but not uncommonly, they do have a pretty nice, genuine understanding. But also, they're liars. They don't do what they say they're going to do. They're riven with jealousy. They're unbelievably ambitious. And it's like they can kind of focus so much on this beautiful understanding. And it's like they don't want to see any of that. And so I'm kind of going, yeah, but what about? And they're going, what about? Yeah, but what about? Yeah, but what about? And we get this, they talk in Zen about 2 arrows in midair that miss, And most often, people like that, unfortunately, they'll end up, it's happened to me, somebody emailed me yesterday who some years ago said to me, you're blind, because I wouldn't acknowledge this bit, because this bit was well, basically they were, particularly if they ended up taking the role of a teacher, they were going to be doing harm. They were going to, because that unaddressed stuff inevitably, absolutely inevitably, gets dumped on the students. And so maybe somebody has an amazing understanding and they're still a nasty piece of work. They're going to cause harm, almost inevitably, almost, as far as I can see. I can't really see how that's not going to happen. Maybe they can in some way seal it off, but I don't think so. There's a really nice book I recommend the guys that I'm training to be teachers. It's called The Drama of the Gifted Child. It's really slim. It's probably less than 100 pages. And it's really written by a psychotherapist for psychotherapists, showing in incredible, just gobsmacking clarity how the stuff that you don't deal with, you end up, in her example, you end up dumping on your clients, completely unconsciously and with the best will in the world. And I think it's completely the same in this arena as well. So part of what I'm doing, I think, is helping people, in that realm. As I say, good chance in most cases that they'll go off and find somebody else to give them a pat on the head. And unfortunately, the world has got another person causing harm out there. But sometimes people are open enough to take on board what you're trying to point at.
Can you think of an example that could be hypothetical or real of a way in which somebody with some insight, let's put it that way, but with this other stuff on the side, might, in a Zen context or a spiritual or meditation teaching context, end up dumping that on the students with the best will in the world unintentionally, for example?
So, all right, a classic example. And, you've probably seen this multiple times, very, very common. Okay, the teacher's done so far, and they've got a good student. Okay, a student who's done so far. This teacher, in some cases, in many cases, if they haven't dealt with their stuff, is going to make it their mission to clip the wings of that student. They're going to see all of that in terms of pride, ego, or whatever, when sometimes it is, but not always, not always. So the teacher, if they succeed in doing what they're unconsciously intending to do, stunts the student.
All right, so you also received Inka transmission from Shinzan whilst you're in Japan, and shortly before you returned to the UK to teach. Can you talk about the significance of having received Inka transmission from Shinzan in that context?
It's like somebody puts a heavy rucksack on your shoulders. Basically, it's like, okay, it's down to you to find the next generation. That's it, really. So you've got to the point where your teacher is, basically giving you that job. You've got to. There's a sort of a conception of a lineage, if you like, and you now have the duty, if you like, to put yourself out there enough to find the next person in the line. One of my dear friends in Japan studied with a beautiful Soto Zen master who he'd been a kamikaze pilot in the war, and the war ended very suddenly before he got to fly his mission. So he was kind of officially a dead man, as it were, and had a terrible sort of struggle, sort of readjusting to society, but did very well, practiced very sincerely, ended up in a Zen monastery. For the first 3 years, he didn't even lie down. He was very, very assiduous in his practice, became a beautiful Zen master. He was the Roshi of a temple up in the north of Japan for, I think, a little bit over half a century. In all that time, he couldn't find a successor. he couldn't find the next generation. He couldn't find a person who he could hand it on to. That's kind of very sad, really, isn't it? But it does happen. But at least the commitment is there to try to do what you can to pass it on, to find the next, the next bit of pipe in the pipeline that you can screw on the end, as it were. Mm.
You mentioned the unfortunate situation of the teacher who Shinzan was very close with, dying before passing the mantle on to him, and then due for the political reasons of the fellow he'd upset in the last monastery, it got blocked. Is that the same as Inka transmission in that case? Or had Shinzan received Inka transmission prior to that?
So basically, that teacher, Inaba Shinden, had told everybody, he'd sort of made it all public. So the actual paperwork hadn't been done. And but that's the case in multiple situations. Even Zen Master Hakuin, who's the big sort of inspiration in the Rinzai Zen line in the last few hundred years, he had no paperwork. So it's pretty common. So the Inka, I mean, it literally means that seal, as in like prime beef, boom, sort of thing. That's taken various forms over the centuries. So in some cases, there's been like a passing on of a particular book, like the Platform Sutra, the teachings of the sixth ancestor was sometimes used as a transmission document. Sometimes the teacher gives a picture of themselves. Sometimes a relic of a previous teacher, and sometimes just a purely verbal thing. These days, most often, it's essentially a bit of paper with a little bit of calligraphy on and a seal and stuff, it's kind of done that way, and institutionally, it's sort of if the fact that the paperwork wasn't there meant that that teacher, that scenario that we talked about, was able to sort of pull the strings in the background, so that Zen Master Shinzan couldn't become the abbot of that particular seminary. Now, if that guy hadn't done that, he would have done, and it would have all carried on. So it's all a little bit more ambiguous than sometimes people sort of make it out to be. But basically, it's that business of you are now expected to not only enjoy your own little corner of the universe, but you've got to try to find somebody who, or some number of people who will carry it on.
Have you given Inka yet to any of your students?
No, I'm a bit of a bastard, really. I'm a bit of a fusspot. I've had people study with me for over a decade now, and some of them I've named as junior teachers, or two, in fact. Three, in fact. Two of them have lasted the course, and I'm seeing people who I can see as senior teachers, and then it would be another stage again. To be a successor, and I hope so. I'd very much like to take this damn rucksack off, let me tell you, but I'm not gonna water it down. I'm not gonna do it till the time's right.
What do you mean when you say you're a bit of a bastard and a bit of a fusspot? What are some of the standards that you just don't compromise on, that some of these people, even who've been around for 10 years?
This stuff that we talked about, if somebody's got unfinished business that particularly is there's any danger or risk that, there's always risk, there's always danger, but clear and present danger, shall we say, that that's going to get dumped on the students, going to cause harm to the students, then I'm happy to wait. I'm happy that we work on that, we sort that, we deal with that.
Do you miss the monastery? Having lived in those monasteries for so long in Japan, very small, remote, very few people there. Now you're in London and outside of, from what I understand, a monastic context, you're living sort of solo teacher.
That's right. Yeah.
Do you miss that life?
Well, so nowadays I live in a ex-council flat just around the corner from the dojo here. And monastery life is a soap opera, really. Human beings, regardless of the haircut they've got, remain human beings. And, it's one of the images they use in Zen is the image of one of these situations where you get a handful of pebbles from the beach and you put them in one of these kind of revolving drums, these rock tumblers, and they grind against each other, and then weeks, months later, out come these beautiful jewels. And monastery life is set up that way. There's no space. I mean, for the first 7 years, I had 3 feet by 6 feet of living space with another guy here, another guy here, and you've got a couple of cupboards. Bottom one's your bedding, top one's your clothes, and that's it. That's where you live, where you sit, where you sleep, where you have some meals, and basically there's nowhere to hide. And so nowadays, I've got this front door. My life is peaceful, pretty much. It's kind of nice. I kind of like it. The ongoing soap opera, if you like, of monastery life. Well, I mean, I can only speak from my own experience, but I've never seen it let up. I've never seen that human being thing somehow fade into some sort of blissful pink glory or whatever. It seems to be not the way, and it's powerful. We have a saying: Buddhas appear troublesomely, and ancestors teach in detail. It's like that person who's completely driving you up the wall at that moment, pushing your buttons like you wouldn't believe, is actually offering you an opportunity, because this stuff that we're carrying around can only get dealt with as it arises. We can't deal with any of it in the abstract. And so in that sense, that person pushing your buttons is the Buddha of the moment. They're offering you this opportunity to deal with your pain, your suffering, and so on. And so, that does work. But the same dynamic, as far as I can tell, is at play in family life as well, and anything where you stick human beings in close quarters with each other. And it's tremendously valuable. And we live in a very atomized world now. Fairly untypical now. One bod in a little flat, own front door. Maybe I get a bit of coming through the floor at the weekends or whatever. That's about the extent of my irritation, from, other human beings. And so, you could say I'm missing out on some stuff there. And maybe that's true. Maybe I'll see at some point, that I'm sliding a whole realm of suffering and avoiding it. Maybe I probably am. And I need something a little bit less comfortable. But for now, it's sort of working, it's working fine. And I've got a ton of other work on. And I've been, the last 5 years, I've been writing quite a bit. And it's a great setting for that, I find. I'm not very good at that whole writing thing, and having that bit of space and solitude helps me to sort of drag out whatever stuff is going to actually get put on paper.
That's fascinating. So earlier you talked about a category of practice which is not universally, as you put in your book, Practical Zen, not universally accepted in all of the Zen schools, but does have a historical precedent. It's very fascinating. This Rikan Naikan bifurcation of practices.
Yeah.
You talked about in your previous monastery how you noticed a lot of the senior monks were getting pretty worn down and quite sick, having ME, chronic fatigue syndrome, as it's known in the States. And you were looking for, when you went to Japan, when you eventually ended up in Japan, you were looking for some practices, the Naikan, I suppose, that would address health or energetic side of things. In your book, Practical Zen, you talk about Hakuin, learning from the hermit Hakuyushi, these sorts of practices. Can you talk a little bit about that category of practice, maybe giving a couple of examples?
Sure. Well, shall I tell the story? Would that be useful for your people?
Yeah, it's a great story. That would be awesome. That'd be great.
Yeah. Okay. So we're talking 250 years ago, roughly. So there was this very keen young Zen aspirant who came to be called Hakuin, became a Zen monk quite young, and had a tremendous fear of death and after death, what was going to happen, all that kind of stuff. And so goes off basically on the road seeking for liberation, seeking for a teacher, and gets very disappointed, very disillusioned, really. Zen at that time is short on really good teachers. So he ends up kind of doing a do-it-yourself job, really. He has a kind of a version of practical Zen that he does it from a Chinese kind of Zen manual that's a sort of almost like a teach yourself Zen book, and he kind of goes off, has a solitary retreat in a storehouse behind the temple he's living in, and he gets it. He gets an understanding, and because there's nobody around to sort of help him along, bearing in mind the stuff we mentioned previously, he has a tremendous, I guess what a psychotherapist, particularly a Jungian type, would call inflation. He starts to think of himself as the most enlightened thing since sliced bread, and he's kind of strutting about, anyway, he ends up by a kind of combination of circumstances. He ends up in front of a good teacher who's able to sort of, as it were, eventually pop that bubble, and as it were, get him back on the path of genuine practice and continuing development. He has another pretty pivotal, important sort of shift. And then he's back on the road again. He doesn't spend very long with this teacher, only about 8 months or so. And then not long after this, so he's young, he's only in his early, probably 24, early mid-20s. He starts to kind of run out of steam. He starts to find himself, well, I can read you the account if you like. Good old Hakuin, he's very graphic. And, here we go. I hit it straight off. Before a month had passed, my heart overheated and scorched my lungs. My legs felt as cold as icy snow. I constantly heard noises in the ears as if I was walking along through a river valley. My liver felt weak. I was afraid of everything. My spirit was distressed and weary. Whether sleeping or awake, I saw illusions and visions. My armpits were constantly drenched with sweat, and my eyes continually filled with tears. I searched out famous doctors and Zen teachers in every part of the country, but found no relief. So basically, he's 24 or so, and he thinks he's going to die. He's kind of completely, essentially what he's done, he's sort of unbalanced his energetic well-being, if you like, his basic vitality. And so the story as he tells it is he's wandering about all over the place, desperate to get a bit of help. And he finds a hermit in a cave a little bit outside of Kyoto. Now, the way he writes the story, it sounds like this guy is totally out there in the deep wilderness. One time I made it a bit of a project to find the cave, and it's I don't know, it's an hour and a half walk out of Kyoto, something like that. It's you're not ascending deep mountains to get there. I mean, it's out there, but it's not totally remote or anything. Anyway, so this guy, this hermit, who that part of Kyoto around that time seems to have had a kind of a school, a sort of a culture school that was very, very interested in Chinese culture, primarily Chinese poetry, but also Chinese medical materials. There was a retired you can still go and visit the building. It's called Shisendo, very beautiful, got an amazing garden and stuff. And it seems that this hermit was a graduate, if you like, of this kind of cultural milieu, this atelier, perhaps you'd call it, and had gone off. And it seems he was a genuine person. They've got his grave and everything. And he seems to have had this kind of knowledge around particularly the medical and energetic system. So Hakuin claims he met this guy. He didn't write any of this down till 30 years after the event. And the year that Hakuin says he met this guy actually, the year before, had fallen off a cliff and died. So there's a bit of a debate whether Hakuin uses this guy to kind of, as a sort of a fictional figure, to crystallize this stuff that he'd worked out himself or picked up, in bits and pieces from here and there, or whether he maybe did genuinely meet this guy, and with it being 30 years after the event, he got his dates a bit mixed up. We don't know, but this guy did exist anyway. So essentially the hermit in Hakuin's account, and he wrote a whole book about this, which we've got translated in Practical Zen. The hermit basically gives Hakuin a series of practices which are basically designed to sort of rebalance and reground the system energetically, to essentially put him back together again. Hakuin goes away. He spends 3 years focusing really on this more energetic based work, puts himself back together again. He has a solitary retreat on a mountain about 8 miles away from my home temple, where a lot of this seems to have really come together for him. He's up on this mountain for about 2 years, and he talks about literally, dancing and like a very embodied dimension of the practice, really taking a large part of things. And then his father's dying. A servant comes and finds, as a family servant, comes and finds Hakuin on this mountain and gets him to go back to his home village to look after his father, who, in his last months. And then Hakuin moves into that little village temple where he became a monk originally, tiny little place, and basically spends the rest of his life simple within the temple. Father's popped off by this point. Word gets out about this enlightened teacher, if you like, in this little village, and students start to come. Now, after a fairly small number of people have come, this little tiny village temple is just packed out. There's no space for any more students to actually show up. So at this point, people still keep coming, and Hakuin basically organizes them into groups of 3 and then just sends them off to just find places to stay. And so these little groups of 3 are staying in like old fishermen's huts or shrines, or some of them are even camping out under trees, until you've got this whole kind of landscape around this little village becoming a sort of a homespun ad hoc training dojo, really. Never been anything like it before or since, really. And so these guys, these young Zen practitioners, are all living in pretty rough conditions, and some of them start getting sick. So Hakuin starts to teach them the stuff that he puts down to what he learned from this hermit. And this kind of evolves into a sort of an architecture of practice, as he puts it, that he calls the 2 wings of a bird, where one wing or one dimension of practice is what he calls a Rikan. So Ri means, it literally means like the veins running through rock, or you could say like the grain in wood, like the threads running through reality, if you like. So Rikan is like contemplation of the truth of things, if you like, the insight practices. And then he combines that with Naikan. So Nai means inner, and Kan again means contemplation. That's these practices which are, as it were, fostering this inner integrity, grounding, empowerment, and so on. The idea being that you, as it were, you not only gain this understanding, but you create the vessel within this body and mind to be able to embody these, so that you can live out the optimal life, if you like, so that you can, as it were, have enough juice in the tank to be able to make a difference in the world, to be able to serve, to be able to actually live out this truth that you've encountered. Now, this formulation of practice seems to have been so potent that within a couple of generations, the students of Hakuin, who, they're coming from this very unofficial, very homespun, ad hoc, rough and ready sort of training matrix, they become the Roshis, or the Zen masters of all the major Zen monasteries in the Rinzai school in Japan. Complete sort of takeover. And scholars have speculated that this formulation was so powerful that that's why that happened. Now, the thing is, in my own experience, quite a bit of this has been a bit de-emphasized in modern day Rinzai. And I asked my teacher about this one time. He was always very keen on all this, and I found it incredible myself. But I asked him why, and he said to me, a lot of the younger guys, the younger Zen teachers and stuff, they want to talk about Zen and quantum physics, and they want to be kind of contemporary and relevant and all that kind of thing, and some of this energetic stuff looks a bit sort of folkloric, or a bit sort of musty, a bit old-fashioned. Now, in my own experience, I've been, a large part of what I've been doing the last 12 years or so since I've been back from Japan has been sort of sharing this particular formulation of practice with people, and that's why I wrote Practical Zen, to put it out there and so on. And it's been extraordinary. It's been it clearly works very, very well within the stresses and strains of modern or postmodern Western, life, with all its chaos and confusion. So that's the basic sort of architecture of just about everything that I'm doing these days. The embodiment side has been a big thread of my own practice, and I'm very keen on the body, and I've made it a sort of a thread within my own life, because the body initially was such a problem within it all, that movement work type practices, yoga type practices, energetic type practices that I've been able to sort of pick up in my own Zen journey, I've sort of brought them all together and made it a bit of a thing, a bit of a thread to sort of put them out there for people. And we have a program for Zen yoga teachers with a Zen, thread in the mix, if you like, in which I sort of share that stuff. We've got about 300 professional yoga teachers out in the world now, various parts of the world. And I think almost certainly, with the way life is going, the way that more and more of us are spending more and more of our time doing this, living on screens, this embodied dimension of practice is only going to become more and more important.
And those Naikan exercises are laid out in great detail, actually, in Practical Zen. And you're in fact offering your 64-hour, 60% stream entry weekend intensive that you discussed earlier in the podcast online. So there's lots of opportunities to study with you online.
Yeah, it's going to be our first go. We've got one coming up in November. And we're doing some kind of dummy runs at the moment, and some road testing and so on. It's clearly going to be the intentionality of the student is going to be very, very important in making this work. So I'm looking at ways that we can sort of bolster and help and support that dimension. That stuff that you talked about previously, the set and setting, is obviously going to be less potent. Certain people are talking about doing things like renting a room in a sort of an Airbnb or something, so that they're just by themselves with their computer for the 64 hours, and maybe things like that might help things along. But I suspect a lot of people are going to be doing it within their family matrix. Maybe the cat's going to be jumping on their head at a certain point, or the kid's going to need the nappy changing, or Lord knows what. So it's going to be interesting to see how we can, make this as potent as possible for people within these constraints. As I say, jury's out. We don't know yet, but we're going to try. We're going to move heaven and earth to make it as good as we can.
Great. And what are those dates? They're coming up quite soon, those debut ones, right?
I don't know. I think it's basically mid-November, I think. And then in Zen, we celebrate the Buddha's enlightenment on December the 8th. They say that at dawn on December the 8th, he sees the morning star, and that's the moment when he gets his shift. And so there's that's a sort of a big date in the Zen calendar, and the December one is around that period, around, I think December the 8th is the third day or something. So it's kind of like early December and mid-November. We've got a website called zenways.org. If people are interested, they can sort of look it up on that.
Well, Daizan, thank you very much for this fascinating sequel.
Thanks. Nice to talk.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.